Our next session here, we're going to go straight through. There's going to be no Q&A. We're breaking this into two parts because afterwards we have a lunch break where the speakers will be around and there'll be plenty of time to talk to them. What will China policy from the incoming Trump administration look like? Jim McGregor is going to be moderating both sessions, and he gets the prize for speaking at all 7 of our annual Future of U.S. China conferences. Part 1 is going to focus on national security and diplomacy. Please welcome Anya Manuel from Rice Hadley Gates and Manuel, and our very own Danny Russell, Vice President of the ASPE Policy Institute. Jim.
All right, thank you, Margaret. We're going to be doing some geopolitical speed dating here. We've got 2 half-hour panels to cover the world. And we got people that know a lot, so we're going to do the best we can to compress things into knowledgeable bits. I want to start out on this first panel of national security and diplomacy and read a paragraph from Yan Shui-tong's Foreign Affairs article last month. Yan Shui-tong, I think many of you know who he is. He's at Tsinghua University at the Institute of International Relations, very well-known Chinese academic. He said, Chinese leaders do not look at Trump with fear. They learned a great deal from his first term. His propensity for economic protectionism will lead to further disputes and rising tensions, but Beijing believes it can navigate such confrontations. Moreover, Trump's dubious commitment to U.S. allies will encourage other countries to hedge their bets, building ties with Beijing to offset the unpredictability of Washington. The likelihood of military clashes with the United States is also low. Since Trump's foreign policies never evinced any deep ideological commitments, it seems unlikely competition between the 2 countries will take on the destructive dimensions of the Cold War. Trump does not want to get enmeshed in wars, would rather focus on domestic reforms. He'll soon arrive in the White House with the intention of containing China, but Chinese leaders are not dreading his return. I just thought I'd let that comment start things. And I think we'll go right to Anya, who's going to be looking really at the China side of things. Okay. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you, James. Thank you to the organizers. When we were discussing this panel in advance, I thought I might do a quick level set of where the Chinese military stands today. When you read about the PLA in the U.S. news, it always is described to be 10 feet tall. And I think that's not quite true. So let me talk about what's going well, what's not going well, and what the Chinese are actually doing in Asia. So Chinese defense budgets are going up 7% year after year after year. They are still significantly lower than the United States defense budget, and they are also lower as a percentage of Chinese GDP than ours are as a percentage of our GDP. Here's where the Chinese are world class. First, as we've all experienced, information operations and cyber. They are excellent. They are way more aggressive than we are on the US side, and I think that continues and continues to be a strength. On the naval side, the Chinese have enormous shipbuilding capacity. I had to read this article 3 times because I couldn't believe it. 230 times as large as the US. We basically have no shipbuilding capacity. And worryingly, recently out of some of those shipyards are coming specialized barges for amphibious assault that really need to be seen as something that's preparing for a possible Taiwan invasion. So that's naval power. On missiles, China leads the world in fielding and deploying hypersonic missiles. On what's going on in deep space, the Chinese are launching more military satellites than anyone else, much more than the US, and they're doing a lot of that also in partnership with the Russians. And on unmanned drones, sea drones, air drones, they are world leading. So now you're all shocked. Let's talk about what's not going so well. Just like we talked about on the last panel, the purges in the PLA are extreme. We are on the 3rd Chinese defense minister in about 2 years. And just before the holidays, there was some articles in the press that he also is now being investigated for corruption or disloyalty. Most of the leaders of China's rocket force, which is their nuclear weapons, have been purged and arrested. 12 senior generals have been purged. And this is a combination of corruption investigations and also, I think, on the Xi side, worry about loyalty. So that's what's not going so well. How does the Chinese military actually show up in the world? I have to tell you, increasingly aggressive. You sometimes see a couple of weeks where they pull back a little bit, but overall we've gone from more and more exercises in the Taiwan Strait to Chinese exercises now all around Taiwan. All of you have read about what's going on with the Philippines and the Second Thomas Shoal. That is not letting up. And I thought one of the best things that the Biden and Xi summit here in San Francisco about 14 months ago accomplished was to reestablish those military exchanges. That may sound esoteric, but during the Cold War, even at the height of the Cold War, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the Soviets always had really good military-to-military communication, so you could diffuse any crisis when it was starting to happen. The Chinese drop those exchanges whenever they get miffed at us, like Nancy Pelosi goes to visit Taiwan or a reason like that. They have been reestablished. Most recently, Paparo, who's our Indo-PACOM commander, spoke to his counterpart. You know, these are formalities, but they're little by little. So I hope that those can continue into the Trump administration. Let me just pause there. Let me also give one caveat that I forgot up front. I currently serve on the US Defense Department Policy Board, maybe for another 3 days until we all get fired. But I in no way speak for the US Pentagon. This is solely my views. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Danny.
Thanks. You know, listening to Anya mentioning purges and loyalty tests reminds me of just how much the US and China at times mirror each other. Because I think that the central contradiction, to use a Marxist term, in the upcoming Trump administration could be divided along horizontal and vertical axes. Horizontally, what I see are factions in the group of Trump officials and courtiers. You have the ultra-China hawks, the national security people, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz. We heard Hegseth's testimony. We heard Ratcliffe's testimony. This is all about the China threat, morning, noon, and night, a paramount enemy must be dealt with. And it's on the military, it's on the technological, and it's on the ideological side as well. You also have the group of people, the Navarros and Greers and so on, who are very focused on tariffs, very focused on trade, very focused on home shoring and sort of the economic agenda and economic interests, not intrinsically concerned about China threat per se, other than the extent to which it's leaching jobs or driving trade imbalances and so on. And interestingly, you also have the, shall I say, self-interested business constituents, the billionaires who have glommed onto Donald Trump and the Trump machine. I'm not going to mention any names, of course, Elon Musk, but at one level they're pragmatists, and we see this in the debate over H-1B visas and so on. But they definitely represent a different constituency. On the vertical scale, something we know from experience from the purges of the past is that, while on the one hand, Donald Trump demands total loyalty and the fealty of his advisors is constantly being proven and they're aligned closely behind him, they actually have a lot of latitude to run government departments and to make decisions in the field, on the ground, on issues that the leader may not be paying particular attention to. But when he does pay attention, when it does enter his field of vision, when a foreign leader with whom he's having a bromance says on the phone, hey, cut me a break, don't do this, you see these really radical and screeching U-turns. So there are some patterns here that while predictions, as Yogi Berra used to say, are hard, especially when they're about the future, there are some things, notwithstanding the mythology of Trump's unpredictability, that do look pretty plausible in Trump 2.0.
Yeah, I learned a new term yesterday talking to a friend in the Silicon Valley, broligarchy. You know, tech bros and an oligarchy together. I think that's what we have coming. Let's talk a little bit, Anya, about the China's involvement with Russia, North Korea, kind of the, I don't know what we call them now, the axis of Mafan or something. You know, tell us about that, because I'd never had any mother in China tell me I can't wait for my daughter to go to college in Moscow.
Yeah.
The way they've
So
tied everybody together, and where China was not headed, and I think where most Chinese people would rather not be.
Yeah, that's a good way to start. So let me start. I don't think it's actually an axis in the sense that all three are working in concert. And then Iran is the fourth one to look into. Look, famously, Russia and China declared their no limits partnership. It has clear limits. I think there is a Putin-Xi bromance. We're going to use that bingo word today.
Yeah.
And while the Chinese have really helped out the Russians with respect to Ukraine, they are buying a lot of extra oil and gas, as we all know. Although it was interesting, I think in a slight nod to the new Trump administration, you saw that some of the ports in China are now abiding by not taking in Russian oil. We'll see how long that lasts, but that's something that was just announced a day or two. So they're buying lots of oil and gas from Russia. Two, what they are doing on the dual-use technology side to help the Russian military has been invaluable to Putin to prosecute the war in Ukraine. And I was in China a few months ago. We had very open conversations with Chinese officials about this. What you get from the other side is blank. Absolutely, this isn't happening. I have no idea what you're talking about. But the evidence is 100% there. They're providing drones. They're providing military optics. They're providing semiconductors. They're pretty much providing everything that Russia cannot get because it's sanctioned.
I was told in Washington that Liu He was brought in to set this up, and that the companies they're working with in China are not the big SOEs, but a lot of different scattered companies, so that if they get sanctioned, they can just change their name and move on, and that Russia went from 80 tanks a year to 1,000 tanks a year, and all of Europe only has 1,000 tanks. Is any of that?
That's exactly right. I mean, I think you and I have the same sources, so if they're wrong, they're wrong. But that's what I'm hearing too. And the concern is, the U.S. can't sanction these little companies because they keep switching.
Yeah.
You can't really do secondary sanctions because secondary sanctions work if we're restricting our big banks from doing business with their big banks. It's very hard to play this cat and mouse game. So I think that will continue. There are, however, limits to the no-limit partnership. I think the Chinese got very concerned about Russia's nuclear saber-rattling in Ukraine, for example. And we know behind the scenes that she delivered a very strong message, which was helpful. And I think the Chinese don't love the second bromance between Putin and North Korea. So let's talk a little bit about China and North Korea. This, of course, has been, it's China's only alliance, amazingly. Its only defense treaty. They're 90% of the North Korean economy. But it's always a little bit of an uneasy relationship. As I said, I don't think Xi and his team like the fact that the North Koreans are delivering all sorts of ammunitions to the Russians. They're uncomfortable about that. They're uncomfortable with how aggressive the Kims have been with their nuclear project. And I think if we're going to predict, and I'd love to hear your views on this, if you think about the crises that aren't totally front and center for the new administration, there's always some country in the world that tests a new administration. And I would put my money on North Korea. They like to get attention. They like to get attention early. So that might be an early crisis you see out of the gate.
Danny, when we were preparing for the panel, one of the things you wanted to talk about is the U.S.-China strategic quest for dominance over each other in technology and so many other things. Do we see that focus making sense, or do we see it accelerating? What's your view on how the Trump administration will move on that?
Well, the very Manichaean characterization of China as the pacing evil threat is a driver behind that kind of competition. It's very well founded in the sense that you and I probably don't want to live in a world in which China has a sufficiently comprehensive, dominating lead in advanced technologies such that in defense terms, in economic and commercial terms, in scientific terms, China's standards and China's values dominate, and we would be playing catch up. So this is a concern that animated the Biden administration and will certainly be a big part of the Trump administration. I think the difference is whether, number one, we are trying to outcompete China or we're trying to crush China. That's a pretty fundamental divergence in tactics. Secondly, and this gets back to the Marxist contradictions of the Trump administration, the idea that you can outcompete, you can contain China at the same time that you are pissing off planet Earth, alienating the world, is a proposition that's been put to the test gently in the past and is about to be scientifically tested. It's not going to work.
Well, is the competition with China, or is it America and China competing for the rest of the world? Because some of the actions we're taking are really pissing off the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to distinguish between those two sets of rivalries, those two dynamics, because they connect. It isn't to win top spot in the Afrobarometer poll of who's got a higher favorability rating, but it is to ensure that the standards that are adopted by, in a sense, of African countries, the equipment that's used, the technology and the kind of values and political biases that inhabit those systems reflect what either Washington or Beijing prioritize. That's the competition, I think. And I would not say, having just come back from Africa, that the United States is doing spectacularly well on that front.
We're not doing spectacularly well. Let me just add to what Danny's saying, because it's a good, actually, continuation from the Made in China 2025 panel, and Gary Reichel here is kind of the foremost expert on this. But when you look at the technologies that I look at that directly impact national security, so that's not absolutely everything, but it's kind of a smaller subset. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of that panel, but when I look at the AI race, for example, the new DeepSeek model and the new Tencent model, but especially DeepSeek, are totally on par with anything we're doing here in the United States. And just was off a Zoom this morning with people who have been playing with it. They did it using far less compute and basically probably using chips that weren't export controlled. So that's not to terrify everyone in a room. It's just to say that the first Trump administration and the Biden administration have had this two-pronged strategy. And the biggest part of the prong was putting a moat around US technology, export controls, making sure the most advanced stuff doesn't get out, and then separately making ourselves run faster. I think the defensive part of that strategy has almost run out of efficacy. We're kind of at the limits of what that can do. So now we really need to focus on running faster. And as you said, making sure that in AI and lots of other these technologies that are dual use, our values become embedded in the way the world adopts them, which is easier said than done.
So just picking up on that again with banging the contradiction drum, there is a very fundamental contradiction between seeking to outcompete China in technology and failing to invest in long-term research development and education, failing to attract and welcome and retain the best minds on planet Earth. Now, I'm heartened to learn that dictators are good at channeling resources towards academic studies and science. maybe the Trump administration will prove to be an example of that. But none of the early indicators suggest that, number one, there is a viable effort to make common cause with the other governments who have thus far aligned pretty closely with the Biden administration and made common cause, presented a unified front, or that there is any realistic prospect of heavy investments either in the U.S. government capabilities themselves. Remember, this efficiency plan is all about slashing, or investment in public research.
That's true. I've not heard the Trump administration say anything about, and if you look at the Chips and Science Act, which was sort of, Exhibit A for the Biden administration, pushing hard for us to run faster. For me, the most significant, it was famously $52 billion for moving some semiconductor fabs here for some semiconductor research. But the part that never got said again, because frankly, no one was lobbying for it, is that there was supposed to be $272 billion over, I think, 5 years in basic R&D, exactly what you're talking about. And by the way, basic R&D never has a good lobby going for it. And so that money has been slashed. Every year, it's underappropriated compared to what was actually authorized in the bill.
And $272 billion doesn't buy what it used to.
Much. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's so much about where are we failing, much less China pushing ahead. I mean, we've made a lot of strides, but just, I was visiting with some chip companies in the Valley the last couple of days, and this most recent chip restriction has got them going ballistic because it takes all countries and puts them in 3 tiers. The first tier is maybe 15 countries that are our friends, and so they can get anything. The last tier 3, is about the same number of countries that can't have anything, China, North Korea, whatever. But in the middle, there's well over 100 countries that now, if they want to get top AI chips, they have to apply for it. They have to meet a bunch of various tests, including, I think, human rights. Well, what we are doing is we are taking a lot of our friends and allies in those middle countries and saying, we don't trust you, and if you want our chips, and I can see somebody coming up with this on a blueprint, but you put it out in the world, it doesn't seem to be helpful in helping people wanting to get along with us. I mean, can we hold on to our allies? China's very good at peeling off our allies with either, as I said in earlier panels, with coercion or money or whatever. I mean,
okay, but it's not only the nefarious hijacking of U.S. partners and allies. The Chinese are opportunistically exploiting the America First bias that suffuses the government or the political class. Because if you declare yourself a leader, but the parties you purporting to lead don't believe that you are thinking and operating in the best interests of the broader group, they're going to hesitate to follow you. The Biden administration worked very, very hard to get like-minded Western nations to take risks and to accept costs to their short-term economic gain and to run the risk of retaliation from China. That was very, very difficult, and they perhaps took it as far as they could. If the effort is in the other direction, if every day begins with what's in it for me, the field is open to the Chinese to make the case that not only are the Americans unreliable, but they're working on an agenda that simply doesn't serve your interests.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I think the first paragraph you read said something similar to the Chinese are good at peeling off allies.
Yeah.
I actually don't think that's true at all.
Yeah.
So the Chinese are excellent at exploiting the spaces in between, right? Bribing and one belt, one roading their way into good positions in small Pacific Island states, in Africa, in parts of Latin America. Allies is different. Like in the United States, allies has a very specific meaning, which is we will come to each other's aid militarily. And the Biden administration, in my view, deserves huge credit for rebuilding the alliances, especially in Asia, especially getting Japan and South Korea to set aside some of their historical differences, to meet together at Camp Davis. If you look at what's happening now at Indo-PACOM, which is our Pacific theater, we've always had military exercises there, but it was, a bunch of boats going in similar places, right? Now, there's, for example, a communication system that allows all of those navies to actually work much more interoperably. And what has happened with the Quad in the last, actually, frankly, a lot of, sometimes these things are more bipartisan than the news would have you believe. But the Quad was really started under the Obama administration, pushed under the Trump administration, and brought to huge fruition just recently in the Biden administration. The amount of cooperation that happens between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States is totally unprecedented. So I don't think there's any way that China is peeling those allies away. They are going to be very good at undermining us in third states and swing states.
Well, I agree.
Comment. We just got the wrap it up sign.
Okay. I agree, but it is dangerous to think of this in binary terms. They're not with us or against us.
Right.
They're hedging. And even with all deference to the Japanese Consul General, even our closest ally, Japan, is logically thinking, maybe this is a good time for our national security advisor to go to Beijing. Maybe this is a good time for the Secretary General of our ruling party to go to Beijing. Maybe this is a good time for Wang Yi to visit Tokyo. Maybe we ought to be talking about Xi Jinping making a visit to Japan. This is not to suggest that the Japanese have been tricked by the Chinese. They haven't been bought, they haven't been coerced, but given the uncertainty and given the experience with America First, all of American allies, in my experience, are taking out small insurance policies. And in the developing world, in the global south, I just add, it is not merely elite co-option, coercion, bribery, malfeasance, although those are the principal tools in the Chinese toolkit. It is also that the Chinese are providing things that communities and countries need and want, things that the United States used to and no longer does. So it's really a global competition. And if it were just a competition, that would be one thing. Competition is like what the Lakers and the Celtics do, and it brings out the best in both sides. This is rivalry. That's what the Crips and the Bloods do. And it causes a lot of damage to all parties.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't need to define which is the Crips, which is the Bloods, but I think we gotta end with that unless you got something really short.
I'm going to end on one sentence. For all of these reasons that are now giving everyone heart attacks in the audience, it's very important that the United States have thoughtful, experienced leadership at the U.S. Pentagon.
Well, there we go. Thank you.
You forgot.